what's the one thing 100% of all women go through, but their experience is almost always unique to each woman? That experience is menopause. So the reality is all of us go through menopause. 100% go through it. Statistically, 87% are highly symptomatic up to 8 years, and 73% seek out help, medical help, and do not get helped. And so to continue my conversation about hormone imbalances, today I'm going to dive into the time period of perimenopause. It's that time period before the menopausal transition, which is one day in your life, 1 year after your last period. However, this is the time period when all of your symptoms are at its greatest, and it's usually gradual in experience. So often women do not understand that this is actually what they're experiencing because they're still having periods, but they're starting to, like, one of my first things is I couldn't sleep. You know, I wasn't sleeping well to begin with, but it became like never going to happen in my planet sort of thing. My sleep just went to hell in a handbag. And so perimenopause is different for every woman, but I want to go into what's going on with perimenopause? What does some of the research show? I did an actual research study looking at 57,000 women's response to a quiz that I had them take about the 5 dominant hormone imbalances, and perimenopause obviously is a big player. The important thing about that quiz and what really showed up in the data was that all women go through perimenopause and menopause. So depending on when you took that quiz, you were probably in that, time period, one or the other. But their other hormones can equally have a disrupting effect, particularly adrenal function and cortisol. But perimenopause is, I think, very confusing for women because it is so very different for everybody. And we've been trained by the media to think that we're looking for hot flashes or night sweats. And if you aren't getting those right in that moment, then you must not be in transition, which is farther from the truth. To be honest, I never had a hot flash. That was not my symptom. I had plenty of other things, but I did not have that. So let's dig in. Perimenopause, right? So again, I said the average woman spends 8 years in perimenopause experiencing symptoms of that transition. Which means that that's a bell curve, right? So on one end of the bell curve, on the far left side, it's going to be almost no symptoms. And then on the other end, it means symptomatic for up to 16 years, if 8's the average. So a lot of women experience things for a really long time. My experience of perimenopause started in my late 30s, and I was through menopause by 49 years old. So I experienced a lot of hormone disruption, and I experienced a long-term effect of those hormone changes. So perimenopause is when we start to see fertility changes. So the hormone scenario that we start to see is we see a change in the and a fluctuation in the secondary hormone called progesterone. We have 3 estrogens. We have estradiol, produced by our ovaries. We have estriol, that's actually produced by the biotransformation or detoxification pathway in the liver off of 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. And so estriol is one of the byproducts of that, and we don't have very much of that circulating. And then we have estrone, that's made by our ovaries, but predominantly made by our fat cells. And that becomes the primary estrogen after menopause, when the ovaries sort of peter out. So those are our 3 estrogens. And they fluctuate throughout the months, and they help bring on the menstrual cycle by the spike of estrogen and follicular and luteinizing hormone that are both pituitary hormones. That is what causes us to ovulate. And then estrogen kind of bottoms out and then peaks again for the next 7 to 10 days as we head into our period. The other hormone that counterbalances that is progesterone. It is busy in the second half of the cycle, post-ovulation. And it's actually the ovulation process that shoots the egg out into the fallopian tube, and the compression and the encapsulation of the corpus luteum is where progesterone is made in the ovary. And so what we see is we become anovulatory, which means that we're not always popping an egg out during perimenopause. So we may not always be producing eggs. And so fertility is affected. But because of that, we don't see the same spike in progesterone. And so what are some of the common symptoms of that? We might get sleep disruption because progesterone helps us stay asleep and helps us utilize GABA more effectively in the brain. So it's also anti-anxiety. So we might see like anxiety or stress response being amplified. Again, sleep may be affected. We might feel more triggered and more irritable. What we may often see too are other signs of what we call estrogen dominance. Now, estrogen dominance is when estrogen is elevated relative to the level of progesterone. Sometimes that can naturally be occurring because we've got some hormonal imbalances that are somewhat genetic or metabolic in nature, like polycystic ovarian syndrome or pseudo polycystic ovarian syndrome, where we've got metabolic changes that affect the function of estrogen and progesterone. But a lot of times we will be estrogen dominant because of the lack of progesterone in the second half of the cycle. And so what often happens there? So when we're estrogen dominant, we can start seeing things like melasma. So one of the things that I saw was, brown spots on the face, and that's a sign of estrogen dominance. We get some, excessive browning, these little patches of spots. That is often happens too when women are pregnant, but we see it in perimenopause. I started seeing acne. I hadn't had acne since I was like an early tween, and all of a sudden I started getting deep cystic acne on my chin and underneath my chin and along my lower jawline. And that was definitely a sign of hormonal imbalance, and it would be painful, and it would get way worse in the second half of my cycle. I also started to notice weight gain, particularly around the hips and thighs and lower abdomen. And so, excessive weight can be also a sign of some perimenopausal hormonal imbalance, and especially around your abdomen and hips and thighs. And it's what I call the jiggly bits, the stuff on the outside that makes it harder for you to lose weight because they're subcutaneous fat. And so we can get kind of a conglomeration of imbalances that result in these symptoms. And then all the perimenopausal symptoms you can imagine: joint pain, irritability, mood swings, weeping, crying, anger, all the things that you associate can all be part of this perimenopausal time period. And so when I had the women do the quiz, I had 57,000 women take this quiz. And there was always a dominant hormone imbalance. And so depending on where the women were, if they were premenopausal, so before complete cessation of the period, they were gonna fall into some of those symptoms as well. And so perimenopause was a big part of it. And one of the things that I found was when I started looking through the data, a lot of the women that were in this time period said that depending on where they were in age, like what their age was, that they experienced significant weight gain, right? That this seemed to be sort of this dividing line. And I know for me, it was kind of like a door closed, and all of a sudden my metabolism was very, very different. And so, it was very evident that something was happening. And that mirrored in the data that the women were like, hey, this seemed to shift my metabolism. So what I'm going to cover today is specifically what ways we can affect estrogen metabolism and this early sort of perimenopausal symptomology nutritionally to help your body function a little bit better. One of the big areas of my research for my dissertation was looking at how we metabolize hormones. So we make our hormones, the ones I described, estriol, estradiol, estrone, and progesterone, and testosterone. And there's several others, but those are our primary sex hormones. And then our body has this complex process in the liver that it goes through to sort of wrap these hormones up and get rid of them. And one of the things that the research is pretty clear on is it's not just about the hormones you make, it's about how you excrete and get rid of your hormones. Because we also have environmental chemicals that mimic hormones in the body. So they basically come in and disrupt your own hormones. So we've got a lot of hormone activity that may or may not be ours. And depending on how we're wired genetically, we might be good at clearing those things out, or we may not be as good. And then depending on how you're living your lifestyle, that may affect the nutrients and the availability of the things you need to help your body detoxify things. So I'm going to describe that process in the easiest way I have found to describe it. So I want you to think of your estrogen as it's a used up something or other. You're ready to throw it out. You no longer need it. It went around and it did its job wherever it needed to do its job in your body. And so it sends it to the liver to get rid of it. And in the liver, the first step is it has to wrap it in a wrapper. And that wrapper is controlled by your genes. So either you're really good at the right wrapper or you're not. It's kind of like the three little bears. I've got a green wrapper that's awesome. It makes it into the cleanest estrogen byproduct. Or I've got a blue one that's so-so, and then I've got a red one. I don't want to produce a lot of red wrapper because the red wrapper leaves that estrogen compound in a state that is not good. So when you get ready to wrap up your estrogens, you have to go through this wrapping process to get it to the trash can. You can't skip over any colored wrappers. So that's the scenario. You have to go in order and you have to have the right colored wrapper. So the first wrapper, the green wrapper, is called 2-hydroxyestrone and 2-hydroxyestradiol. That is a more protective pathway. It's considered safer because it doesn't produce metabolites of estrogen that might bind to receptors and do DNA damage. So 2-hydroxyestrone is considered protective. How we eat and the nutrition that we take can influence that pathway pretty heavily. The one that is kind of in between is 16-alpha hydroxyestrone. It has been shown early on in studies to potentially have some relationship with breast cancer. It has kind of gone back and forth today, but we would still put it in an unfavorable pathway. And then from that 16-alpha hydroxyestrone pathway, you make estriol, right? And estriol is a weaker estrogen. It's protective, like we use it along with estradiol in topical formations for hormone replacement and also for vaginal cream delivery and also facial estrogen to help reduce signs of aging. So estriol is made off that blue pathway. So that's kind of your in-between. It's not perfect, but it's in between. Now, the less favorable estrogen metabolism pathway is 4-hydroxyestrone. And the reason why 4-hydroxyestrone is damaging is it is able to bind to DNA as a hydroxyestrone quinone and damage DNA in a cell. It doesn't do it every single time, but it has a propensity to potentially do that. And it has associations with things like breast cancer. So the rule is you don't want to have a bunch of things going down that 4-hydroxyestrone pathway, the red pathway. So we've got the green, the blue, or the red pathway. Now, there's a bunch of nutrients that affect that pathway. So, for instance, your cruciferous vegetables, brassica family, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, green vegetables in many forms contain nutrients that improve or push that green pathway. So it helps you make more green wrappers. For instance, to slow down the red pathway, there's citrus bioflavonoids, curcumin, citrus extracts that can also help push things out of that red pathway. Hops, as a matter of fact, also does that. So if I want to reduce the amount of red that I'm making, red wrapper, I can also add citrus bioflavonoids and extracts that can help move that pathway the other way. And then the 16-alpha is affected also by your nutrients as well, green tea extracts, a couple other ones. So when I'm looking at things to help reduce estrogen dominance, I think about how do I get rid of my environmental estrogens and the broken, kind of used up pieces of estrogen that are in the liver. So I want to think about those first. Now, once I get the red, the blue, or the green wrapper, I have to pass it to a next set of genes. And those genes are COMT-co-methyltransferase, the glutathione binding genes. Those are very, very important. So they're part of our detox pathways. And also some of the biggest mutated pathways we see in genetics, which we've been doing for over a decade in our clinic. And so that depends on your precursors to glutathione, right? So glutathione itself, which is your major antioxidant, but things like alpha-lipoic acid, cysteine, vitamin C, and acetylcysteine, all those things are really important ingredients to help you make glutathione, which is your next wrapper. I like to call it the pink wrapper, right? So I want to be able to get a lot of pink wrappers around my trash. Also, COMT, co-methyltransferase, is dependent on folate, B12, and B2. And so if I don't have enough of my B vitamins, I won't be able to make the COMT pink wrapper, and I won't be able to recycle my estrogens very well either. So I can't get them out of circulation. So when I look at the state of perimenopause and the symptoms of perimenopause, I want to think about those things because I want to make sure my pink wrapper is adequate to grab a hold of everything else that's wrapped in either red, blue, or green. Right? So imagine I have a used up estrogen. It's got a green wrapper around it. Now it's got a pink wrapper around it. Now I got to get it to the dumpster. I have two dumpsters. I have a sulfation dumpster, which is a gigantic dumpster that you put outside like a construction dumpster. And then I have glucuronidation, which is a office trash can that can hold stuff, but it doesn't have the same volume. Your estradiol, once metabolized, goes dominantly through glucuronidation. So it goes to the office trash can. Estrone, which is pro-inflammatory, dominantly goes through the urine, through sulfation to the dumpster, the big dumpster. And that's important because it is then dependent on your gut for estradiol, because estradiol is going to go out through stool. So a lot of your estradiol is being processed through the gut. And if your gut's not healthy, you won't process it well. That was my entire dissertation. And then if you look at the urinary pathways of sulfation, the big dumpster, if you aren't good at liver detoxification or don't have the right nutrients, you never get to the dumpster, right? So when you think about perimenopause and the symptoms, there are two major parts. They are the estrogen that you make and clearing, and are you getting it to the trash can appropriately or not? Because chances are you're in a dominant state because of those reasons, and number two, because progesterone is already declining, and so you don't have the counterbalance of progesterone to control estrogen. So when I looked at building products, because I did build products, I had 57,000 women who gave me their experience. I got 20 years of experience, 2 masters and a PhD in human biochemistry. This is my jam. So I finally said, okay, let's get some products together that really work. And I specifically wanted products that worked very cleanly in the estrogen pathway and progesterone. So one of the first ones that I did is called Menopause Mastery. It's metabolic blueprint products. And I want to explain why I picked what's in these, because this will help you understand when you're looking at products for hormone balancing what may be important. So one of the important ones was vitamin E. So vitamin E is very important to estrogen metabolism, but it's also cardiovascular protective. It's a massive antioxidant. The geranol, which is an active ingredient in vitamin E, mostly found in the form of a natto vitamin E, also protects osteoblast activity and improves it in bone turnover. So it's hugely important. It's a hugely important fat-soluble antioxidant and fat-soluble vitamin that we need. But a study in cancer epidemiology, biomarkers, and prevention in 2002 looked at vitamin E and the 2-hydroxylation estrogen pathway, which is the beneficial pathway. And what it found is that it sort of kicked it into high gear, right? So it helped make more green wrappers. That's super important. That helps me make sure that I can get that first stage cleared really, really well. The next ingredient is a thing called calcium deglucarate. This one was very intimately involved in my research because I was looking at how we get our hormones through our gut and how they interact with our microbes, because there's a lot of interaction there. There's a lot of receptors for this stuff in the gut, and we're only barely covering the surface of what's going on there. So calcium deglucarate is a calcium, but is bound to deglucarate. It doesn't absorb very well as far as the calcium itself, so it doesn't highly impact the calcium levels in the body. But what it does do is it supports the stool form pathway that helps you get the glucuronidated, or let's say the, estradiol gets the green wrapper, red wrapper, or blue wrapper, and then it's got the pink wrapper on it, and it helps it get it to that office trash can so you can throw it out. What it does is it keeps that last wrapper wrapped around the estrogen so it can get thrown out. Because your gut bacteria can produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, and what it does is unwrap that wrapper and allow that broken estrogen to get recirculated through the body. And all of that happens in the gut. And so if you take calcium deglucarate, it keeps the things bound in the gut and ready to go out, so you can't recirculate it. It's very, very important because your microbes very much affect your hormone balance. And so calcium deglucarate is very valuable in that pathway. And one of the early research studies that looked at it was Alternative Medicine Review, that really looked at that calcium deglucarate can help eliminate not only the hormones, but also various estrogen-like toxins, your BPAs, your pesticides, your herbicides, your phthalates. Those things can be influenced by calcium D-glucarate. My other favorite ingredient, but this has to be, so this is one of the things that I see practitioners screw up sometimes, is diindolyl methane, or DIM, or indole-3-carbinol. DIM is actually a derivative of indole-3-carbinol. Most of the research was actually done on the parent ingredient called indole-3-carbinol. But DIM is often used in hormone modulation because it improves the amount of green wrapper estrogen. So it improves the production of 2-hydroxyestrone, the cleaner pathway. Now, why this is important is you got to know where it's going. So 2-hydroxyestrone and DIM strongly affect estradiol. Now remember, estradiol is your ovarian form of estrogen. So in somebody who is in their 20s and 30s and maybe they're getting hormonal acne, probably using DIM will help because it'll lower the overall production of estradiol that might be contributing. In a woman in early perimenopause, where they might be estrogen dominant because progesterone is already declining, using a healthy dose of DIM can help reduce overall estrogen load, particularly estradiol. Now, what you don't want is very high doses of DIM in a woman who is on the very tail end of perimenopause or menopause, or somebody that is doing menopause hormone replacement therapy, because what you might be doing if you give too much is you'll reduce the estradiol levels, more preferentially than estrone. So it's about dosing and when and how. So the amount of DIM is really important. I put a therapeutic dose of DIM in my product, but I didn't put really high doses because I want to modulate it. I don't want to shut down any estradiol circulating. And I see it a lot when practitioners aren't really familiar with how our body metabolizes these hormones. They overdose DIM, and then the person is constantly chasing more and more hormone therapy for estradiol when they probably don't need it. They just need to change it. So how does DIM work? It modulates estrogen metabolism by changing the CYP1A1 and 1B1 enzymes. Those are the two enzymes that produce the green wrapper. So think of it, it makes the green wrapper and it influences the red wrapper. It reduces red wrapper and increases green wrapper. Right? That's the way to think about it. So it shifts metabolism towards a 2-hydroxyestrone. And its parent hormone or parent ingredient, indole-3-carbinol, it's found in cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli seed extract being the most important. Again, this increases 2-hydroxyestrone and estradiol. But when we look at broccoli sprout extract, which is the parent ingredient in this product, it also contains sulforaphane. And sulforaphane works up the chain. So sulforaphane helps detoxify across all boundaries, but it also helps influence a little bit of aromatase, which is the production of testosterone to estrogen, and it helps a little bit downstream. So we get improvement across the board when we use broccoli seed extract with indole-3-carbinol and DIM, which is why it's in my product. Now, flax lignans. So flax lignans are really interesting because they are a phytoestrogen, but they are a very weak phytoestrogen. And flax lignans have been studied in breast cancer research because they are actually protective against breast cancer reoccurrence and metastatic activity. And it's because they are a weak estrogen component that can kind of slide into that estrogen receptor and block other estrogens, especially like environmental estrogens. So they modulate estrogen metabolism through that way. And in a study by Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers and Prevention in 2000 found that flaxseed supplementation, both flax oil and the fibrous seeds, increased urinary excretion of 2-hydroxyestrone, particularly in postmenopausal women. So it helps favorably affect the receptors, and it also helps go down the green wrapper pathway of estrogen. So flax lignans are also really good. And of course, if you're also doing flax seed and flax oil, you get additional benefits. And so when we look at the next ingredient, green tea extract. I love green tea extracts. It's one of my favorite. It's green tea catechins, which are helpful for the brain. They're helpful for estrogen. They're helpful for dementia risk. Even body composition, green tea extracts have shown to improve metabolism. So they're awesome. So the green tea catechins may modulate estrogen metabolism through a couple different things. Mostly what they do is they affect the aromatase enzyme, which is controlled by the CYP19 gene. And so aromatase is the enzyme in our ovaries that take testosterone and make estradiol. Aromatase is also the enzyme that takes testosterone in your fat cells and converts it to estrone. And for instance, when we look at breast cancer treatment, often if it's estrogen receptor positive, they give drugs that sort of block aromatase. That's the reason why. But when we look at green tea extracts, they modulate the effect of aromatase, influencing estrogen synthesis in a positive way. And so this is valuable because it can help balance your hormones without directly being hormones. And then all of this is happening in the liver. So this is important. So all of your estrogen biotransformation and detoxification are happening in the liver, and then they get excreted in the stool and the urine. Milk thistle, which contains silymarin, is a supportive liver metabolism ingredient. It supports liver detoxification and estrogen metabolism. And a study done by Integrative Cancer Therapies in 2007 really suggested that milk thistle could support liver function and definitely through estrogen metabolism. And it's really working in concert with the CYP enzymes, and particularly indole-3-carbonyl, DIM, and sulforaphane are being helpfully induced by milk thistle. And then obviously promoting the 2-hydroxylation or the green wrapper. These ingredients help you move towards a cleaner estrogen pathway. So essentially, the Estro Balance Mastery helps you kind of lower the amplitude of your estrogen changes. So if you think of amplitude as kind of your up down, so you don't, kind of like blood sugar, you don't want wild highs and wild lows. Same thing with your estrogen. You really don't want them to go wild high, wild low. You want to kind of flatten the curve. And so these herbs help modulate that in a way that's protective through modulating mostly liver function, which is why I like it, because it can get rid of some of those symptoms pretty easily. Now, the other thing that is really important is this time period, premenopausal or perimenopausal time period, is hallmarked by the slow decline of progesterone, right? So progesterone declines. That's why we see fertility changes. And it's a slow roll. It doesn't drop off a cliff like estrogen does, but it's a slow roll. And so progesterone can be replaced. Now, obviously, therapeutically, you can replace progesterone with high doses or relatively high doses or therapeutic doses through bioidentical hormone therapy. And we do that out of our team at getminerva.com. We have telemedicine providers that do that, and we do hormone therapy. However, we can use cosmetic use progesterone made from yam extracts, Mexican yam extracts, and plant extracts to support low levels of progesterone. And so I created a product called Progest Mastery for the people that are entering into perimenopause. They may not need a therapeutic dose at 100, 200 or more milligrams of progesterone, but they might need 50, right? So 50 milligrams of cosmetic use progesterone. And it can be easily put on. It's one pump is 50 milligrams, and you rub it into like the inner arm. And where I see this type of intervention help is that second half of the cycle, usually about day 14 through 28 from the first day of your period, is where progesterone should be climbing. And often if we use a little bit of that during that time period, it usually improves the bloated, cranky, angry, irritable sort of symptoms that we get, sleep issues. Progesterone's really, really valuable sleep, but it gets rid of some of that arc that we see on that second half of your cycle called the luteal phase. The beauty of this product also is it is in organic jojoba oil, and it's got aloe, and so the base is beautiful too. So it's lovely, but it can be used as a therapeutic level without being prescriptive because it's not at prescriptive strength. And so I love it for that. Now, if somebody's on the tail end and they are at the point where they might need hormone replacement because they're going through menopause, and then I would say you probably want to go to a therapeutic dose and start working with somebody to actually replace your hormones prescriptively. But we can often intervene with some over-the-counter stuff very early on. So Progest Mastery helps sort of balance. And like I said, early on, I do it, after ovulation through the day I start the period again to mimic what your body naturally does. Now, if you have incredible sleep problems, you could try using it every night and do it at bedtime because progesterone induces a little bit of sleep because it helps GABA and often so it can help be a little bit relaxing. So you would use progesterone at night, but it can be super valuable. The other thing that I honed in on, if you listened to my podcast last week, you'll know that stress chemistry and adrenal problems supersede all the other hormones, and it is by far the most dominant answer that we get on my hormone quiz. The other part is if you're really stressed out, which I don't know any woman in their 40s and above, maybe way out of retirement. Sometimes people aren't super stressed out, but most of us spend these decades just like burning the candle at both ends. But being able to control the cortisol and especially reduce the amount of free circulating cortisol by allowing it to metabolize to its inactive form, which is cortisone, which allows your body to sort of down-regulate that stress response and calm you down. The other product I use a lot in perimenopause, and it's part of my perimenopausal bundle, is a thing called Stress Less Mastery. And it's a combination of philodendron and Magnolia officinalis bark, which is called Relora. It's been studied, that actual ingredient has been studied heavily because it helps metabolize cortisol in a more positive way. So you don't have excessive free cortisol circulating, so it's calming without sleep inducing. So it's anti-anxiety producing. And it's also got a little bit of L-theanine in it, which helps improve GABA levels, which GABA is your natural anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. So between those ingredients, you get a kind of 1-2 punch to kind of calm things down. Because the reality is your progesterone levels will decline and be more stiffly in decline if you are stressed out, because your body, the hypothalamus and the pituitary in the brain are going to tell your body, divert efforts from making progesterone into cortisol when you're stressed out. And then when everything sort of balances back out, it can shift back to producing more progesterone if you still have the capacity to produce it. And so stress will induce a progesterone deficiency situation all on its own. And a lot of women going through fertility issues, that's playing a role for them. And so the Stress Less Mastery is my other sort of packaged product in this suite of products for perimenopause. Like I said, we're focusing on helping estrogen get metabolized properly and sort of flattening the curve a little bit of your estrogen spikes during perimenopause. We're improving progesterone by making sure we have a little bit of progesterone on board, and also flattening the curve of estrogen does help the progesterone that you're making balance it more sufficiently. And then Stress Less Mastery helps convert cortisol to cortisone, inactivating it and helping your body modulate cortisol better so it gets the brain message to make more progesterone. So that's the way to sort of use these tools, these supplemental tools, to improve your perimenopausal symptoms. And then obviously if you do all of that and you're dialing in your sleep, you're dialing in your exercise, which I'm not going to go in today, and you're improving all of those other things and you're still having issues, you might be knocking on menopause's door, or you may be in the kind of second half of that period where it might be worthwhile to look at hormones. I don't think everybody on the planet has to be on hormones, but I do think most women are candidates for hormones, and it's worthy of exploration if you've done everything naturally and it's still not working. So, all right, to recap what you learned, the way to improve your perimenopausal symptoms are: number 1, reduce cortisol by helping your body modulate it to a less active form called cortisone and working on your stress response so your body can make more progesterone. And replacing progesterone if you don't make enough anymore, which is likely if you're in your 40s, because you can replace it. You can start with over-the-counter and then work towards prescriptive strength. And the other way to improve the symptoms is reduce the crazy arc that happens with estrogen relative to progesterone, particularly in the second half of the cycle, by helping your body wrap up and clear estrogen and estrogen metabolites in a way that is healthy through the liver, so you have less of those things circulating. Because again, we have so many environmental chemicals that look like estrogen to our body that our body is responding as if it is, and that's adding to the estrogen burden. So those are the ways to really modulate the perimenopausal symptoms and help you get to feeling better. And that's what we really want, right? Because we have big things to do in our life, and we want to really, really come out in the world and do the things that we want to do, and we don't want to feel like crap in order to do it, right? So I hope you found this to be a helpful episode of Menopause Mastery. And if you did, share it with a friend, because together we rise. And I will be back with you next week on Menopause Mastery.